5 of the most decorated mercenary captains in the outer spiral were standing in my war room, and 3 of them were trying to leave. I had spent 4 months assembling this coalition. 4 months of negotiations, contract revisions, logistical planning, and the kind of careful diplomatic work that earns a Valith Dominion liaison a promotion. Everything was locked. Transports loaded, battle plans approved at every level of command. We had over 2,000 hardened fighters from 4 different species, all aimed at one target, a mining colony called Kareth 6 that had been seized by insurgents 8 months ago. Then the intelligence update hit the holotable, and my entire operation fell apart in less than 6 minutes. The update was simple: a single line of confirmed field intelligence. A small human contingent, approximately 35 operators, had been identified on the ground at Kareth 6. They had been hired by the insurgents. 35, not 300, not 3,000. 35 individual humans. Gaussen was the first to move. He was a Drukhari warlord, 7 feet of armored muscle and scar tissue. A fighter who had personally led boarding actions against fortified orbital stations. He shoved 2 of my security officers aside, like they were made of paper, and walked straight for the door. He did not say a word. He did not look back. Captain Veln of the Shattered Fang Company transmitted a withdrawal notice before the briefing slide had finished rendering. I watched the notification appear on my console and felt my stomach drop. The Shattered Fang were supposed to be our primary ground force. 300 elite Gasari shock troops, gone with a single transmission. The third captain, a Krethian named Basori, was more polite about it. He stood, adjusted his collar, and said he would need to review the terms of engagement in light of new operational variables. He was out the door before I could respond. I stood at the head of the table with my mouth open, watching the most expensive military operation of my career disintegrate in real time. "This is unacceptable," I said, and I hated how thin my voice sounded. "We are talking about 35 combatants. We have over 2,000. Someone explain this to me." The room had gone quiet. The remaining 2 captains exchanged a look that I did not understand at the time, but would come to understand very well in the days that followed. It was the look of people watching someone walk toward the edge of a cliff and knowing that no warning would be enough. Captain Palix of the Iron Wake Company was the one who finally spoke. She was older than the others, a Krethian female with deep scars running across the left side of her face, and a mechanical arm that clicked faintly when she moved it. She had fought in more engagements than most soldiers survived in a lifetime. She did not stand. She did not move toward the door. "I will honor my contract, Commander," she said. Her voice was flat, without emotion, and somehow that was worse than panic. "But you need to understand what you are sending us into. Those are not soldiers down there. Those are humans, and you have no idea what that means." I wanted to argue. I wanted to pull up the species classification database and point to the line that read, Category 3, Mid-Tier Threat Assessment. Humans were supposed to be a moderately capable species from an unremarkable world. They had only been part of the galactic community for a few decades. Their technology was functional but not exceptional. Their military forces were small compared to the great powers. There was nothing in any official record that justified this kind of reaction. But 3 mercenary companies had just voided their contracts, and each of those captains had fought through things that would have broken most species. Gaussen had survived an extinction-class engagement on Dravith Prime. Veln had held a position against 10-to-1 odds during the Gasari border wars. These were not cowards. These were professionals who had weighed the situation and concluded that no amount of money was worth stepping onto a world with 35 humans on it. I needed to understand why. Captain Palix stayed in the war room after everyone else left. She sat in her chair with her arms crossed, studying me with an expression that might have been pity. "You have never encountered humans before," she said. It was not a question. "No," I admitted. "I have not." "Then you should do your research before we launch this operation, Commander. Because if you go in blind, you will get every soldier under your command killed, and you will not even understand how it happened." She left me alone in the war room with the intelligence update still glowing on the holotable. 35 humans. A number so small it should have been a footnote. I returned to my quarters and accessed the Dominion's classified military database. If there were combat records involving humans, I would find them, and I would understand what everyone else seemed to already know. The first thing I noticed was the access level. Human engagement files were restricted at a classification tier I had only seen applied to extinction-level weapons research. I had to use my operational authority codes just to open the index, and even then, several files were redacted beyond anything I could access. I opened the first file. It was an after-action report from a border skirmish on a world called Verath II. A Gisari mercenary force of 80 soldiers had engaged 12 humans in a jungle environment. The engagement lasted 9 days. 6 Gisari survived. I opened the second file. A Drukhari raiding party had attempted to seize a human-operated cargo vessel in deep space. The ship had a crew of 23, only 4 of whom had any military training. The Drukhari sent 40 boarders. The boarding action lasted 11 hours. No Drukhari survived. The human crew lost 2 people and resumed their shipping route the next day. I opened the third file. It was a planetary engagement, a proper military operation with combined arms and orbital support. A coalition force of 600 had attempted to dislodge a human defensive position manned by 41 operators. The coalition had air superiority, armored vehicles, and supply lines. The humans had rifles, improvised fortifications, and whatever they could build from the environment around them. The engagement lasted 4 days. The coalition withdrew, after sustaining 60% casualties. Human losses were 3 wounded, none killed. By the third file, my hands had stopped being steady. I sat back in my chair and stared at the data in front of me. The numbers did not fit any tactical model I had ever studied. Every engagement followed the same impossible pattern. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and by every measurable standard, outmatched. And they won. Not occasionally, not through luck. They won consistently, decisively, and in ways that left the surviving opposition too shaken to explain what had happened. I had 2,000 soldiers preparing to assault a position held by 35 of these people. For the first time since I received this assignment, I felt something cold settle into the base of my spine. Not fear, I told myself. Concern. Professional concern. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I began a deeper investigation. If the files could not fully explain what humans were, I would find someone who had faced them and survived. Someone who could tell me, in plain terms, what I was about to send my forces against. It took me half a day to locate Tolvek. He was a retired Gisari mercenary, living on Relay Station Korath, a trading post on the edge of the outer spiral. He had fought humans on Verath II. He was one of the 6 survivors from that file I had read the night before. When I connected the communication channel and his image appeared on my screen, I understood immediately that whatever had happened on Verath II had never really ended for him. He was missing 2 limbs and most of his lower jaw, replaced with crude mechanical substitutes that looked like they had been installed in a rush and never properly maintained. His remaining eye had a distant quality to it, the look of someone who was always partly somewhere else. I explained who I was and what I needed. I told him about the operation, about the 35 humans on Kareth 6. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. "How many soldiers do you have?" he asked. "Over 1,100, after the withdrawals." "It is not enough." "They are 35, I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice and hating it. Tolvek leaned forward, and the mechanical jaw clicked as it moved. I went to Verath II with 80 of the best soldiers I had ever commanded. We had trained together for years. We had fought together through campaigns that would make your coalition forces look like children playing at war. We outnumbered the humans nearly 7-1, and we had every advantage. Better equipment, better supplies, knowledge of the terrain. He paused, and I watched something move behind his eye, a shadow of memory that had clearly never faded. The jungle was dense. Visibility was poor. We knew they were in there, and we had their approximate position from orbital scans. So we advanced in standard formation, covering all angles, exactly as we had been trained. The first 2 days were quiet. We found signs of their camp, Evidence they had been there, but they had moved. We tracked them. We thought we were hunting. His mechanical hand clenched on the table in front of him. On the third night, they took our rear guard. 4 soldiers, dead in complete silence. No weapons fire, no alarms, just 4 bodies found at dawn, with their throats opened. They had been standing within arm's reach of each other, and not one of them had made a sound. I felt my throat tighten but said nothing. We tightened formation after that. Set double watches, motion sensors on every approach. On the 4th night, the sensors went off everywhere at once, every direction. The jungle was screaming with alerts. We opened fire into the darkness and hit nothing. When the shooting stopped, 2 more soldiers were dead inside our own perimeter. Inside it, Commander, they had been among us while we were firing outward. Tolvek's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. By the 6th day, my soldiers were breaking. Not from casualties, though those were mounting, from the fear. The humans left things for us to find. Equipment from our own dead, arranged in patterns. Tracks that led in circles. One morning, we found our company banner planted in the center of our camp. None of our sentries had seen anything. The humans were ghosts. And the worst part, he said, and here, his voice cracked slightly, was what our scouts reported between the attacks. They found a human camp, recently abandoned. There were the remains of a fire, cooking equipment, and the ground around the fire was pressed down in patterns that suggested the humans had been sitting together, relaxed. Our audio sensors had picked up fragments from the night before. Laughter. They were laughing, Commander. And one of them was singing. He looked directly into the camera. We were being hunted. We were losing soldiers every night. We were falling apart from fear. And they were sitting around a campfire, enjoying their evening. That is what humans are. That is what you are sending your soldiers against. I ended the call and sat in silence for a long time. The operation was launching in less than 36 hours. I had 1,100 soldiers, 2 mercenary companies, and a personal career riding on the success of this mission. And everything I had learned in the past day told me I was walking into a disaster. But I had my orders. The Valith Dominion expected results. The mining colony needed to be retaken, and I was not going to be the commander who flinched because of stories and old soldiers' nightmares. I pulled up the real-time surveillance feeds from Kareth 6 and began studying what the humans were doing on the ground. What I saw made the cold feeling in my spine spread deeper. The human contingent had transformed the colony. In the weeks since their arrival, they had repurposed the mining facility's industrial equipment into defensive emplacements that my tactical AI struggled to classify. Drilling rigs had been converted into fixed weapon platforms. The colony's sensor grid, designed to monitor geological activity, had been rewired into a comprehensive early warning network that covered every approach vector within 30 kilometers. Ore processing equipment had been modified in ways my engineers could not fully understand from orbital imagery alone. But that was not the worst of it. The humans were not just fortifying, they were teaching. Live feeds showed human operators working alongside the colonists, drilling them in defensive tactics, weapons handling, communication protocols. They were turning the civilian population into a supplementary fighting force. The insurgents had been disorganized when they seized the colony. Now, 8 weeks after the humans arrived, they were moving with coordination and purpose. I counted the colonists on the feeds. There were approximately 400 of them, and while they were not soldiers by any standard, they were learning fast. The humans had given them structure, confidence, and most dangerously of all, something to believe in. I showed the feeds to Palex. She watched in silence, her mechanical arm clicking softly at her side. They are not just defending that colony, she said finally. They are building something, a community, a unit. Those colonists would have scattered at the first shot a month ago. Now look at them. They are still civilians, I said. They are civilians being led by humans, Palex corrected me. That is a very different thing. The assault fleet entered the Kareth system 14 hours later. 3 transport ships, 2 escort frigates, and my mobile command vessel. As we crossed into sensor range of the colony, my communications officer looked up from her console with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Commander, we are receiving a transmission from the surface. It is not targeted at us specifically. It is a general broadcast on an open channel. What is it? She hesitated. It appears to be music, sir. She put it on the speakers. The sound filled the command center, and every officer in the room went still. It was a human song, something with deep drums and a driving, relentless rhythm. There were voices layered over the beat, raw and powerful, building towards something that felt like a challenge. They were broadcasting music at us. Palix was standing beside me. She had gone completely rigid, her scarred face locked in an expression that I would later identify as the look of someone who has just confirmed their worst suspicion. "They know we are coming," she said quietly, "and they want us to know they do not care." I gave the order to proceed with deployment. As the transports descended toward the surface of Kareth 6, I could still hear that music echoing through the ship's corridors. My soldiers heard it too. I watched their faces as the sound reached them, and I saw something crack behind their eyes. We had not fired a single shot yet, and the humans were already inside our heads. The assault plan was textbook. 3 landing vectors, simultaneous deployment, a classic pincer approach designed to compress the enemy's defensive perimeter from multiple directions. Vector Alpha would push through the colony's outer industrial ring from the north. Vector Bravo would approach from the east through the ore processing yards. Vector Charlie, the smallest force, would secure the colony's southern access tunnels and prevent any retreat. I commanded from a mobile operations center positioned 2 kilometers behind the front line, linked to every squad through real-time tactical feeds. Palix led Vector Alpha personally. The second company's captain, a young Drukari named Sereth who had stayed for double hazard pay, led Vector Bravo. Vector Charlie was handled by a mixed unit under one of Palix's lieutenants. The first 30 minutes after deployment were silent. Not quiet, silent. There is a difference that I did not fully appreciate until that day. Quiet means the absence of loud sounds. Silent means the absence of any sound at all. And in a colony that should have been home to hundreds of people and dozens of industrial systems, total silence was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Palix reported it first. "Commander, there is nothing on the scans. No movement, no heat signatures, no electronic emissions. The outer ring is empty." "The surveillance feeds showed activity in this sector 6 hours ago," I said. "I know what the feeds showed. I am telling you what is in front of me right now." Nothing. The scouts pushed forward. Corridor by corridor, building by building, they advanced into the colony's outer industrial zone and found it abandoned. Equipment was powered down. Lights were off. The air recyclers were running on minimum, creating a low hum that was the only sound in the entire sector. I ordered Vector Bravo to accelerate their advance. If the outer ring was empty, the defenders had pulled back to the colony's central hub, and I wanted to close the distance before they could finish whatever preparations they were making. Sereth acknowledged the order and pushed his forces forward through the ore processing yards. His troops moved in tight formation through corridors lined with massive refining equipment, towering machines that cast deep shadows across every approach. The first explosion came at 1437, and it was not an explosion in any conventional sense. A pressurized gas line running along the ceiling of the main processing corridor ruptured simultaneously at 12 points across a 60-meter span. The gas was not explosive. It was a high-density industrial coolant that, when exposed to atmosphere, expanded into a cloud so thick it blinded every visual and thermal sensor in the corridor. Sereth's vanguard, 120 soldiers, was swallowed by the cloud in 3 seconds. Then the gravity plating activated. Mining colonies use adjustable gravity systems in their industrial zones, allowing workers to handle heavy equipment more easily. The humans had reprogrammed the floor plates in the processing corridor to maximum output. Soldiers who had been advancing at a steady pace were suddenly pinned to the floor under 4 times standard gravity. Armor that weighed 8 kilograms suddenly weighed 32. Weapons became impossible to lift. Soldiers who tried to stand found their own bodies too heavy to support. And that is when the lights started. The corridor's industrial lighting system began cycling at a frequency that my science officer later identified as specifically calibrated to overwhelm Krethian and Gasari visual processing. A strobing, pulsing pattern that turned the gas-filled corridor into a disorienting nightmare of shadows and flashes. My soldiers could not see, could not move, and could not orient themselves. The first shots came from inside the cloud. I watched the tactical feed dissolve into chaos. Individual squad markers began flashing red, then going dark entirely. Audio channels filled with overlapping reports, shouted warnings, and the distinctive sound of human weapons fire, a sharp, controlled cracking that cut through the noise like a blade. "Vector Bravo, report status," I ordered. Sereth's voice came back strained and barely controlled. "They are in the walls. They are using the maintenance access ways. We cannot see them. We cannot get clear shots. Commander, they are cutting us apart." I switched to Palix's channel. "Vector Alpha, what is your status?" "We have made contact," Palix reported, and her voice was the flat, emotionless tone of a professional who is managing terror through sheer discipline. "Small teams, 3 to 4 humans per unit. They are not holding positions. They hit and move. We push through one corridor and take fire from behind. We clear a room and find they have already moved to the next junction. Commander, they are faster than anything I have ever fought." The tactical display in front of me was turning red across every vector. I watched squad markers wink out one by one, and each dark marker was a soldier who was either dead or too incapacitated to maintain their comlink. But it was the drone feeds that truly showed me what I was facing. I had deployed observation drones throughout the colony, small autonomous units that provided overhead visual coverage. Through their lenses, I watched the humans fight, and I understood, with terrible clarity, why mercenaries fled at the mention of their name. They moved like water. There is no other way to describe it. Each fire team of 3 or 4 operated as a single organism, flowing through corridors and rooms, with a coordination that should have required neural linking, but they had no implants, no shared tactical network. They communicated through gestures, glances, brief vocal sounds that carried more information than full sentences. A hand signal from one would redirect the entire team's movement without a single word being spoken. I watched a human take a plasma graze across the left shoulder, a wound that would have dropped most species into shock. The humans shifted their stance slightly, adjusted their grip on their weapon, and continued firing without a visible change in accuracy or speed. Another human, cut off from their team by a collapsing barricade, found themselves facing 8 Drukhari soldiers in a corridor with no exit. Any rational combatant would have surrendered. The human charged. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to every survival instinct, that the Drukhari hesitated for a fraction of a second. In that fraction, the human closed the distance and was among them. 4 Drukhari went down before the remaining 4 could react. It was not just their physical capability that was breaking my forces. It was the psychological warfare. In Vector Alpha's sector, the humans used sound as a weapon. They would let a group of mercenaries advance through a quiet corridor, then fill the space with noise from every direction, shouts, metallic crashes, the sound of boots on metal grating. The mercenaries would spin, weapons raised, hearts hammering, and find nothing. Then silence again. Then a single shot from a direction they had already cleared. In one corridor, my drone captured footage of a Gasari fire team, veterans with decades of combined experience, refusing to advance. They were standing at a junction, weapons aimed at 3 different corridors, trembling visibly. They had not taken a single casualty. They had not seen a single enemy. But they had heard movement in the walls, and they had found a piece of their own equipment, a helmet, that belonged to a soldier from the previous squad, placed carefully in the center of the junction. The humans were not just fighting my army. They were dismantling it psychologically, turning every shadow into a threat, every silence into a warning. 2 hours into the assault, the advance had stalled on all 3 vectors. My forces had pushed approximately 400 meters into the colony's outer ring and could not move further. Casualties were mounting at a rate that my tactical AI kept flagging as unsustainable. And then the humans did something that the AI had calculated as impossible. They counterattacked. 35 humans should not be able to launch a counterattack against a force of 1,100. The math does not work. The force ratios do not support it. Every tactical model in my system said the humans should be conserving their numbers, trading space for time, fighting a defensive withdrawal toward the colony's core. The humans had not read those models. They came from everywhere at once, and they were not alone. The colonists, the 400 civilians that the humans had been training for the past 8 weeks, emerged from maintenance tunnels, ore shafts, and ventilation systems across the entire outer ring. They appeared in sectors that my scouts had cleared hours earlier, armed with mining tools, modified industrial equipment, and the handful of proper weapons the humans had distributed among them. The colonists were not professional fighters. Their aim was inconsistent, their tactics were basic, and they made mistakes that cost some of them their lives. But they did not need to be professional. They needed to be numerous, coordinated, and willing to fight, and the humans had given them all three. The effect on my forces was devastating. Soldiers who had been struggling against 35 humans now found themselves surrounded by hundreds of fighters emerging from the infrastructure itself. Positions that had been secured were suddenly under attack from behind. Communication lines were cut, as colonists who knew the colony's systems better than anyone jammed frequencies and rerouted power to seal blast doors. The vanguard, 400 of my best soldiers, collapsed in 19 minutes. I watched the retreat unfold on my tactical display, and among the chaos and the horror and the professional devastation of watching an operation disintegrate, one image from the drone feeds buried itself into my memory and refused to leave. A human, moving through a corridor where the fighting was heaviest, spotted a wounded colonist lying exposed in a crossfire zone. The colonist was young, barely more than an adolescent by the standards of their species, and they were bleeding from a wound in their side. The human did not hesitate. They broke from cover, sprinted across the open space, and reached the colonist, while plasma fire struck the walls around them. A round caught the human across the back, leaving a burn that I could see smoking through their suit. The human did not stop. They pulled the colonist behind a structural support, checked the wound, applied a field dressing, made sure the young colonist was stable, and then turned back to the fight. They treated the colonist's wound before their own. The mercenary standing next to me in the command center had been watching the same feed. He was a Krethian, one of Palix's senior officers, a fighter with 30 years of experience. He spoke without looking away from the screen. They are not fighting for pay. The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to look at him, and his expression was something I had never seen on a combat veteran's face before. It was awe, the raw, helpless recognition of something that transcended his understanding. "Then what are they fighting for?" I asked. He stared at the screen where the human was now firing from behind the same support column, one hand on their weapon and the other resting on the injured colonist's arm, as if to reassure them. "Something worse," he said quietly. "They care about those people." I gave the order to retreat. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, and I felt the weight of my entire career collapsing around them, but I gave the order. Across the colony, my forces began pulling back, fighting rearguard actions through corridors that had become killing grounds. Palix's voice came over the command channel, and there was no satisfaction in it, just a deep, weary certainty. "I told you, Commander." The withdrawal took 4 hours. 4 hours of fighting through our own approach routes, which the humans had seeded with additional traps behind our advance. 4 hours of carrying wounded through corridors filled with smoke and the echoes of fighting. 4 hours of losing soldiers in a retreat from 35 humans. When the final transport lifted off from the surface of Kareth 6, I stood at the observation port and watched the colony shrink below us. Somewhere down there, 35 humans and a few hundred colonists were watching us leave. I wondered if they were celebrating. I suspected they were already preparing for the possibility that we would come back. The numbers came in during the flight back to the staging area, and they were worse than I had feared. 362 dead, 219 wounded, many critically. Equipment losses included 14 armored vehicles, 38 drones, and enough weapons and supplies to outfit a small army, all abandoned during the retreat. Human casualties, as far as our intelligence could determine, 4 wounded. None killed. We had outnumbered them more than 30 to 1. We had superior equipment, orbital support, and the element of choosing when and where to attack. And they had not lost a single fighter. The surviving mercenary captains held an emergency meeting in the staging area's command room, and it was barely short of open mutiny. Sereth, nursing a plasma burn across his forearm and the shattered remnants of his professional pride, declared his contract void under the excessive force clause. His remaining soldiers were already loading transports. They would be gone within the hour. The third company's senior officer, a Drukari sergeant who had inherited command after his captain was killed in the retreat, said nothing at all. He simply stood, placed his company's contract token on the table, and walked out. His soldiers had been loading transports since before the meeting began. Palak sat in her chair, cleaning a weapon component with methodical precision. She did not speak. She did not need to. Every person in that room knew she had warned them, and the silence from her direction was louder than any words could have been. I was left with Palak's Iron Wake Company, roughly 300 soldiers, and a mission that was now impossible by any conventional measure. The Dominion expected the colony retaken, my superiors expected results, and I had just lost more than a third of my force to an enemy that had not even fully committed to the fight. Then the intelligence officer brought me the report about the prisoner. We had captured a human, not through superior tactics or skill, but because this particular human had done something that made no rational sense. During the retreat, when my forces were pulling back through the colony's eastern corridors, a group of colonists had been caught in the open, unable to reach the safety of the inner hub. One human had stayed behind to cover their retreat, fighting a sustained rearguard action against an entire platoon. The human had held the corridor for over 20 minutes, long enough for every colonist to reach safety, and had only stopped fighting when their ammunition ran out completely. The platoon had expected the human to surrender at that point. Instead, the human had attempted to fight with an empty weapon, using it as a blunt instrument, and had to be physically restrained by 6 soldiers. The prisoner was being held in a secured compartment on the command vessel. I went to see them immediately. The human was sitting on the floor of the holding cell when I arrived, leaning against the wall with their legs stretched out in front of them. They looked up when I entered, and what I saw on their face was so unexpected that I stopped in the doorway. They were smiling, not a threatening smile, not the bared teeth aggression display that some species use. A genuine, warm, friendly smile, the kind you might see from someone greeting an old acquaintance. "Hey there," the human said. Their voice was casual, conversational, as if we were meeting at a trading post rather than a military detention facility. "I am guessing you are the one in charge? Nice ship, by the way. The gravity plating is much smoother than what we have back home." I stared at this person. This was a human who, by the counts from the engagement footage, had personally killed at least 11 of my soldiers in the past 6 hours. They had fought until they physically could not fight anymore, and now they were complimenting my ship's engineering. "I am Commander Zorvale," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Cade Morrow," the human said, extending a hand through the barrier grate, in a gesture that I had been briefed on, but never experienced. A handshake. A human greeting ritual, involving physical contact. "Good to meet you, Commander." "Well, circumstances could be better, but you know what I mean." The Krethian guard standing beside the cell looked at me with an expression of barely concealed unease. I later learned that the human had spent the past hour asking the guard questions about their homeworld, their family, and their armor, which the human had apparently described as looking really solid. I conducted the interrogation personally. It was the most unsettling conversation of my life. Cade Morrow answered questions freely, not in the way of a prisoner trying to buy time or trade information, in the way of someone having a conversation, someone who genuinely seemed interested in the exchange. They asked my name twice, making sure they pronounced it correctly. They asked about the Valith Dominion's structure, not probing for intelligence, but with what appeared to be authentic curiosity. They made a joke about the food they had been given that made the guard almost smile before catching himself. And in between the pleasantries, Morrow dropped pieces of information that turned my blood to ice. "Your force composition was pretty standard for a contracted colonial recovery operation," Morrow said casually. 2 primary ground elements with light vehicle support, 1 flanking element through the tunnel network, command and control position roughly 2 clicks behind the front. Textbook stuff. I kept my face neutral, but my hearts were hammering. How did you know our force composition? Morrow shrugged. We have been watching since you entered the system. Honestly, Commander, and I do not mean this as an insult, but your operational security is not great. We had your command structure mapped out by day 2. The Drukari company that pulled out early, that was smart of them. The Krethian captain, Palax, she is good. You should listen to her more. They knew Palax by name. They knew which companies had withdrawn and when. They knew where my command post was positioned. They had been studying us while we planned to attack them. You have been very forthcoming with information, I said carefully. Morrow tilted their head, and the smile shifted to something almost gentle. I am not telling you anything that matters anymore, Commander. The fight is over. You are going to withdraw. You know it, I know it, and Captain Okonkwo knows it. Captain Okonkwo? Our commander, Dara Okonkwo. She is the one you should be talking to, not me. I am just a grunt who ran out of bullets at the wrong time. I left the holding cell with more questions than I had entered with, and a growing suspicion that this entire situation was not what I had been told it was. The humans were not behaving like mercenaries. They were not protecting that colony the way a contracted force protects a client. There was something else happening on Kareth 6. Something that my mission briefing had either missed or deliberately omitted. I attempted direct communication with the human commander. The response came back within minutes, audio only. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and carried a warmth that seemed entirely out of place in a military communication between opposing forces. Commander Zorvale, the voice said, I am Captain Dara Okonkwo. I have been hoping you would reach out. Captain Okonkwo, I am contacting you to discuss terms for the resolution of this engagement. Terms, of course. There was a pause that felt weighted with something I could not identify. Let me be straightforward with you, Commander, because I think you are someone who respects directness. We are not leaving. These people hired us to protect them, and that is what we are going to do. I have the authority to commit significant additional resources to this operation, I said, knowing it was a bluff, and suspecting she knew it too. You can send more soldiers. You can send a fleet. But every single person who steps into this colony will face everything we have. And Commander? Her voice dropped slightly, not threatening, almost sympathetic. We have not shown you everything yet. The line went dead. I sat in the silence of my command center and felt the shape of this situation pressing against me from every direction. Palax found me there an hour later. She came in without asking permission, sat down across from me, and placed her mechanical hand flat on the table. You have spoken with their commander, she said. Yes. And you are beginning to understand. I looked at her, and I let the mask of command authority drop for a moment. Tell me what you see, Captain. Tell me what I am missing. Palax was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different than I had heard it before. Not the flat professional tone or the careful neutrality. Something rawer, something honest. 18 years ago, I fought alongside a human unit on Kellis 4. We were contracted to defend a supply depot. The humans were part of a separate contract for a nearby settlement. When the depot was overrun, my forces retreated to a secondary position as per our contract terms. The settlement was secure. The humans had no obligation to help us. She flexed her mechanical arm, and the clicking sound seemed louder in the quiet room. They came anyway. 30 humans left a defended position and crossed 6 kilometers of open ground under fire to reinforce a force they had no contract with, no obligation to, and no connection to, beyond the fact that we were fighting on the same world. They took casualties doing it. They lost people. And when I asked their sergeant why, do you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, you looked like you needed help. That was it. That was his entire reason. Not money, not obligation, not strategy. They saw people in trouble and they came. She leaned forward. Those humans on Kareth 6 are not mercenaries in any sense that you or I understand the word, Commander. I have been reviewing the colony's communication logs. The humans arrived on a transport contract, passing through the system. When they learned what was happening to the colonists, the forced displacement, the corporate seizure, they offered their services for almost nothing. They stayed because they chose to stay. Why? I asked, though I was beginning to know the answer. Because the humans bonded with those people. They ate with them. They learned their children's names. They helped repair homes and fix water systems, and teach young ones to read. And somewhere in that process, they decided that those colonists were theirs, their people, their responsibility. Palix looked at me with eyes that held the weight of every battle she had ever fought. You are not fighting a mercenary company, Commander. You are fighting humans who have decided that those colonists belong to them. And there is no price tag on that. No force calculation. No contract clause. Once a human decides you are under their protection, the only way to get through them is to kill every single one. And the ones you kill will die, making it so expensive that you will wish you had never started. She stood up. So the question you need to ask yourself, Commander, is not whether you can take that colony. Given enough time and enough resources, perhaps you can. The question is, what it will cost, and whether what you find at the end is worth the price. She left me alone with that question. I spent the next 12 hours doing something I should have done before any of this began. I pulled the complete administrative file on Kareth 6, not the military briefing, not the operational summary, but the full legal and colonial record going back decades. What I found changed everything. The colonists on Kareth 6 had been granted legal settlement rights 42 years ago under the Valith Dominion's Colonial Expansion Charter. They had built the colony from bare rock, established the mining infrastructure, and operated it productively for 4 decades. Their legal claim was documented, registered, and had been renewed 3 times through proper administrative channels. 18 months ago, a Valith mining conglomerate called the Tessaran Group had filed a mineral rights reacquisition claim through political channels that bypassed normal colonial oversight. The claim had been approved through a process that my legal analysis flagged as, at minimum, procedurally irregular. The colonists had been reclassified as illegal occupants of their own homes and served with an eviction order. The insurgency was not an insurgency. It was families refusing to be thrown out of the homes they had built and lived in for 42 years. And the operation I had been contracted to execute was not a colonial recovery mission. It was a forced eviction on behalf of a corporation that had obtained its authority through what appeared to be corruption. I sat in my quarters and stared at the data and felt something shift inside me. Not just the cold calculation of a military officer recognizing a flawed mission. Something deeper, something that had been forming since I watched that human run through plasma fire to reach a wounded colonist. The next morning, I did something that would almost certainly end my career. I contacted Captain Okonkwo and requested a personal meeting on the surface of Kareth 6, in person, alone, unarmed. The response took 7 minutes, and when it came, there was a note in Okonkwo's voice that sounded almost like surprise. "You are serious about this, Commander?" "I am." "Then come. We will meet you at the southern landing platform." My protocol officers were horrified. Palix watched me prepare for the descent with an expression caught between admiration and disbelief. She said nothing until I was at the shuttle door, and then she spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "Either the bravest thing I have ever seen a Valith commander do, or the most foolish." "Perhaps both," I said, and stepped aboard. The shuttle descended through Kareth 6's thin atmosphere, and as the colony grew larger in the viewport, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear was still there, buried beneath layers of professional composure and deliberate breathing, but above it was something else, curiosity, and, though I would not have admitted it at the time, a growing respect for the people I was about to meet. 2 humans and 3 colonists were waiting at the landing platform. The humans were armed, but their weapons were holstered, and their posture was relaxed. One of them, a tall man with dark skin and a scar running from his temple to his jaw, nodded at me as I descended the shuttle ramp. "Commander Zorvale, I am Lieutenant Gareth Hale. Captain Okonkwo is waiting for you in the main hall. This way, please." I followed them into the colony, and every step revealed something that contradicted what I had expected to find. I had imagined a military fortification, hardened defensive positions, and grim-faced fighters preparing for the next assault. What I found was a community. Yes, there were signs of the battle, scorch marks on the walls, a collapsed section of corridor that had been hastily reinforced, damaged equipment awaiting repair. But around and between those signs of conflict, life continued. Children were playing in a cleared courtyard, chasing each other around a piece of mining equipment that someone had painted in bright colors. A human woman was sitting on a crate near the courtyard entrance, teaching a group of young aliens a rhythmic clapping game. The children were laughing, and the human was laughing with them, and the sound echoed through the corridors like something warm and alive. In a workshop, I passed a human man working alongside an elderly colonist to repair a water recycling unit. They were arguing about the best approach, not with hostility but with the comfortable friction of colleagues who had done this many times before. As I passed, the elderly colonist said something that made the human burst into laughter, a full, genuine sound that seemed completely impossible given that this colony had been under military assault less than 48 hours ago. The main hall had been the colony's communal dining area. It was large, filled with long tables, and at the moment I entered, it was occupied by a mix of humans and colonists eating together. Some sat in mixed groups. Others worked on equipment repairs at tables cleared for the purpose. Two colonists were teaching a human some kind of card game, and the human was losing badly and appeared to be enjoying every moment of it. Captain Dara Okonkwo was sitting at a corner table with a cup of something warm in her hands. She was shorter than I had expected, compact and solid, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that bore the scars of decades of work in combat. She looked up as I approached, and her eyes were the calmest I had ever seen on any sentient being. She stood and offered her hand. I took it, and her grip was firm and brief. "Commander Zorvale, sit down. Can I get you something to drink?" The colonists make a local brew from the mineral moss that grows in the lower tunnels. It is an acquired taste, but I have acquired it. I sat across from her, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, the sounds of the colony filled the silence: conversation, laughter, the clatter of tools, the high voices of children, the sounds of people living their lives. "I have reviewed the colony's legal status," I said. Something shifted in Okonkwo's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone who has been waiting for a particular card to be played. "And what did you find?" "The colonist settlement claim is legitimate. It has been for 42 years. The reacquisition order was obtained through channels that appear to involve significant procedural violations, likely corporate corruption at the administrative level." Okonkwo nodded slowly. "We came to the same conclusion about 3 days after we arrived. The colonists have every legal right to be here. The eviction order is not worth the screen it was transmitted on." "Then why did no one challenge it through legal channels?" Okonkwo's smile was thin and sad. "They did. They filed challenges, appeals, petitions. Every single one was denied or delayed, or lost in the system. The Tessaran group has the money and the connections to make legal challenges disappear. The colonists spent their savings on lawyers who could not get a single hearing scheduled." She set down her cup and looked at me directly. "That is when they put out a call for help. Not for soldiers, Commander. For anyone who would listen. And we happened to be passing through." "Why did you stay?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer. I had known it since Palix told me about Kellis 4. I had known it since I watched the drone footage of a human sprinting through fire to reach a wounded child. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. She looked across the hall to where a young colonist was sitting with a human, both of them bent over what appeared to be a technical manual. The human was pointing at something on the page and explaining it, and the colonist was nodding with the intense focus of someone learning something that mattered to them. "We docked at this station for a routine resupply," she said. "Standard transport contract, carrying agricultural equipment to a settlement 2 systems over. We were going to be here for 6 hours to refuel. That was it." She paused, and something moved behind her calm expression, something deep and fierce. "When we docked, the first thing I saw through the airlock was a family in the corridor, a woman carrying a child, pulling a second child by the hand, with everything they owned in 2 bags. The children were crying. The woman was not crying, but her face had the look of someone who had used up all her tears and had nothing left. Okonkwo's hands tightened around her cup. I asked what was happening. She told me the mining company had seized her family's quarters, 4 rooms they had lived in for 17 years. Her children had been born in those rooms. She had nowhere to go. I went back to my ship. I told my crew what I had seen. I did not order anyone to stay. I did not make speeches or invoke any grand principle. I just told them what I had seen, and I said I was not leaving until those people had someone standing between them and the company that was destroying their lives. She looked at me, and her eyes were steady and uncompromising. Every single member of my crew volunteered, not because I asked, because they saw the same thing I saw: children crying in a corridor, families losing their homes, people being crushed by a system that was supposed to protect them. And we could not just leave. That is not something we are capable of. I thought about the classification files I had read in my quarters. Category 3, Mid-Tier Threat Assessment. It was laughable. No classification system could capture what I was seeing in this room, what I had seen on the battlefield, what was radiating from this woman like heat from a star. Humans were not defined by their combat capability, or their technological level, or their physical attributes. They were defined by this terrifying, magnificent capacity to look at strangers and see family, to bond across species, across cultures, across every logical boundary, and to fight for those bonds with everything they had. This is what made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy, not their strength, not their tactics, not their adaptability, their love, their absolute, unshakable refusal to walk away from people they cared about. What would you have done if I had sent the fleet? I asked. Okonkwo looked toward the courtyard, where the children were still playing. Her smile returned, and this time it did not reach her eyes. There was something behind it that I recognized as the same thing I had seen in the combat footage, a determination so deep it went beyond will into something more fundamental. We would have made it cost more than anyone was willing to pay, she said, and then we would have kept going. I believed her completely. I stood up from the table and straightened my uniform. Captain Okonkwo watched me without speaking, and in the silence between us, something passed that did not need words: an understanding, a recognition of where the lines of right and wrong actually fell, as opposed to where my orders said they should be. I am withdrawing my forces from the Kareth system, I said. I am filing a formal legal challenge against the operation contract, on the grounds that it was issued under false pretenses by the Tessaran Group. The colonists' settlement claim will be submitted through independent judicial review. Okonkwo's expression did not change, but her shoulders dropped by a fraction, and I realized that for all her composure, she had been carrying a weight that she was only now allowing herself to set down. Thank you, Commander. Do not thank me. What I am doing will almost certainly end my career. Maybe, she said, but you will be able to live with yourself. That counts for more. I left the colony the way I had entered, alone and unarmed, walking through corridors where humans and colonists moved around me, with the easy rhythm of people who had built something worth defending. Lieutenant Hale walked me to the shuttle and shook my hand at the ramp. Fair winds, Commander, he said. I do not know what that means. He smiled. It means I hope your journey is a good one. The shuttle lifted off, and I watched Kareth 6 fall away beneath me for the last time. Somewhere in that colony, children were playing. A human was teaching a card game. An old man and a young soldier were fixing a water recycler and arguing about the best way to do it. 35 humans had held that colony against 1,100 soldiers, not because they were invincible, not because they could not be defeated, but because they had decided that those people were worth fighting for. And once a human makes that decision, there is no force in the galaxy that can make them stop. I recorded my personal log during the transit home. I spoke into the recorder for a long time, organizing my thoughts, processing everything I had witnessed. And when I reached the end, I found myself writing words that I knew would follow me for the rest of my career. I recommended the Valith Dominion reclassify humans from Category 3, Mid-Tier Threat Assessment. My suggested new classification was simple, because no existing category could contain what I had seen. No viable threat assessment. Not because humans cannot be measured. They can be counted, their weapons cataloged, their physical capabilities documented. But because those measurements miss the point entirely. They miss the woman who saw children crying in a corridor, and decided that she would fight a war for them. They missed the soldier who ran through fire for a wounded stranger. They missed the laughter around the campfire while the enemy's army closes in, not because the humans did not understand the danger, but because they had already decided that the people beside them were worth more than their own safety. I have filed my report. I have submitted the legal challenge. The Tesseran Group's representatives are already lodging formal protests, and my superiors have made it clear that my career trajectory has been permanently altered. I do not regret it. Because I have seen what humans are, and I understand now why the galaxy's most hardened mercenaries turn and walk away when they hear that humans are on the other side of a fight. It is not cowardice, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that you cannot defeat a species that fights for love, because love does not run out of ammunition. It does not calculate acceptable losses. It does not weigh the cost against the benefit and decide that the margin is not worth it. Love fights until there is nothing left, and then it fights harder. They are just humans. That is what I said when the intelligence report first appeared on my holotable. That is what everyone says, just humans. A Category 3 species from an unremarkable world in an unremarkable system, nothing to worry about. Everyone says that. Right up until the moment those humans decide you are a threat to something they care about. Right up until they look at you across a battlefield, with eyes that hold no hatred, no malice, just an absolute, unbreakable commitment to the people behind them. And in that moment, you realize that just human is the most dangerous phrase in the known galaxy. I closed the recorder and sat in the silence of my quarters as the ship carried me home. Through the viewport, the stars moved past, like distant fires, each one a system full of worlds where humans might have found someone worth protecting. And I thought about what Captain Okonkwo had said when I asked what she would have done if I had sent the fleet. We would have made it cost more than anyone was willing to pay, and then we would have kept going. They are, without question, the most terrifying species I have ever encountered, not because of what they can do, but because of what they will never stop doing. They will never stop protecting the people they love. They will never stop fighting for the stranger they met in a corridor. They will never stop seeing family in the faces of people who look nothing like them. And that is why mercenaries are terrified, not of the weapons, not of the tactics, not of the strength or the endurance or the adaptability. They are terrified because when you fight a human, you are not fighting a soldier. You are fighting a promise, and humans do not break their promises.